Hello everyone, I am Eden Emmanuel, and for today's presentation, I will be advocating the 14 learner-centered psychological principles.
So, before we start with the discussion of the 14 learner-centered psychological principles, what is learner-centered? According to Darlene McDonough, learner-centered is the perspective that focuses on individual learners with respect to their heredity, experiences, perspectives, backgrounds, talents, interests, capabilities, and needs. Now, let's proceed to the 14 learner-centered principles that were put together by the American Psychological Association, which pertains to the learner and the learning process. So it is divided into 4 factors. We have the cognitive and metacognitive factors that have 6 principles. We also have the motivational affective factors with 3 principles. We have the developmental and social factors with 2 principles. And lastly, we have individual differences factors with 3 principles. So now, let's start with cognitive and metacognitive factors. Number 1 principle is nature of the learning process. The learning of a complex subject matter is most effective when it is an intentional process of constructing meaning from information and experience. Okay, there are different types of learning processes. For example, habit formation in motor learning, and learning that involves the generation of knowledge or cognitive skills and learning strategies. Learning in schools emphasizes the use of intentional processes that students can use to construct meaning from information, experiences, and their own thoughts and beliefs. So, we have our own learning process. We can learn in school and we can learn in different environment. We can learn in based from our experiences and based from our own knowledge and skills. We'll move on to successful learners. So, to be a successful learner, we need to be active. An active student take part in the teaching and learning process. Second is goal-directed. A learner should set goals for themselves. Then lastly is self-regulating. Self-regulating learner knows how to monitor his or her progress and monitor the strategies that is being used. Okay, let's proceed to the number 2 principles. The number 2 principle is goals of learning process. The successful learner over time and with support and instructional guidance can create meaningful, coherent representations of knowledge. So, the strategic nature of learning requires students to be goal-directed, to construct useful representations of knowledge, and to acquire the thinking and learning strategies necessary for continued learning success across the lifespan. Students must generate and pursue personal relevant goals. So, as a teachers, we need to help our learners to their own learning goals, and we need to help our students to identify their goals. Okay, now let's move on to number 3 principles under cognitive and metacognitive factors. It is the construction of knowledge. The successful learner can link new information with existing knowledge in meaningful ways. Knowledge widens and deepens as students continue to build links between new information and experiences in their existing knowledge base. The nature of these links can take a variety of forms, such as adding to, modifying, or reorganizing existing knowledge or skills. Educator can assist learners in acquiring and integrating knowledge by a number of strategies that have been shown to be effective with learners of varying abilities, such as concept mapping, thematic organization, or categorizing. Did you guys understand? Okay, now let's move on to number 4 principles, the strategic thinking. The successful learner can create and use a repertoire of thinking and reasoning strategies to achieve complex learning goals. Successful learners use strategic thinking in their approach to learning, reasoning, problem solving, and concept learning. They also continue to expand their repertoire of strategies by reflecting on the methods they use to see which work well for them, by receiving guided instruction and feedback, and by observing or interacting with appropriate models. Learning outcomes can be enhanced if educator assists learners in developing, applying, and assessing their strategic learning skills. Okay, now let's proceed to the number 5 principles. The number 5 principle is thinking about thinking. Higher order strategies for selecting and monitoring mental operations facilitate creative and critical thinking. Successful learners can reflect on how they think and learn, set reasonable learning or performance goals, select potentially appropriate learning strategies or methods, and monitor their progress toward these goals. Now let's proceed to the number 6 principle is context of learning. Learning is influenced by environmental factors including culture, technology, and instructional practices. Teachers a major interactive role with both the learner and the learning environment. Cultural or group influences on students can impact many educationally relevant variables, such as motivation, orientation toward learning, and ways of thinking. Technologies and instructional practices must be appropriate for learners' level of prior knowledge, cognitive abilities, and their learning and thinking strategies. Now, let's move on to motivational and affective factors. The number 7 principle is motivational and emotional influence on learning. What and how much is learned is influenced by the motivation. Motivation to learn, in turn, is influenced by the individual's emotional states, beliefs, interests, and goals, and habits of thinking. Motivational and emotional factors also influence both the quality of thinking and information processing as well as an individual's motivation to learn. So positive emotions such as curiosity generally enhance motivation and facilitate learning and performance. Okay, now let's move on to number 8 principle, and which is the intrinsic motivation to learn. The learner's creativity, higher order thinking, and natural curiosity all contribute to motivation to learn. Intrinsic motivation is stimulated by tasks of optimal novelty and difficulty, relevant to personal interest, and providing for personal choice and control. So curiosity, flexible and insightful thinking, and creativity are major indicators of the learner's intrinsic motivation to learn. Educators can encourage and support learners' natural curiosity and motivation to learn by attending to individual differences in learners' perceptions of optimal novelty and difficulty, relevance and personal choice and control. Okay, now I hope you understand this part. Okay, let's move on to number 9 principle, which is the effects of motivation on effort. Acquisition of complex knowledge and skills requires extended learner effort and guided practice. Without learners' motivation to learn, the willingness to exert this effort is unlikely without coercion. Effort is another major indicator of motivation to learn. Educators need to be concerned with facilitating motivation by strategies that enhance learner effort and commitment to learning and to achieve high standards of comprehension and understanding. Now, let's move on to developmental and social factors. And the number 10 principle is developmental influences on learning. As individuals develop, there are different opportunities and constraints for learning. Learning is most effective when differential developmental within and across physical, intellectual, emotional, and social domains is taken into account. Individuals learn best when material is appropriate to their developmental level, is presented in an enjoyable and interesting way, because individual development varies across intellectual, social, emotional, and physical domains. Now let's move on to the number 11 principle, social influences on learning. Learning is influenced by social interactions, interpersonal relations, and communication with others. Learning can be enhanced when the learner has an opportunity to interact and to collaborate with others on instructional tasks. Learning settings that allow for social interactions and that respect diversity encourage flexible thinking and social competence. Now let's move on to the individual differences factors and the number 12 principle, which is individual differences in learning. Learners have different strategies, approaches, and capabilities for learning that are a function of prior experience and heredity. Individuals are born with and develop their own capabilities and talents. In addition, through learning and social acculturation, they have acquired their own preferences for how they like to learn and the pace at which they learn. Now let's move on to the number 13 principle, which is learning and diversity. Learning is most effective when differences in learners' linguistic, cultural, and social backgrounds are taken into account. The same basic principles of learning, motivation, and effective instruction apply to all learners. However, language, ethnicity, race, beliefs, and socioeconomic status all can influence learning. Now, let's move on to number 14 principles. The last principle is standards and assessment. Setting appropriately high and challenging standards and assessing the learner as well as learning progress, including diagnostic process and outcome assessment, are integral part of learning process. Assessment provides important information to both the learner and the teacher at all stages of the learning process. Effective learning takes place when learners feel challenged to work towards appropriately high goals. Therefore, appraisal of the learner's cognitive strengths and weaknesses, as well as current knowledge and skills, is important for the selection of instructional materials of an optimal degree of difficulty. Performance assessments can provide other sources of information about the attainment of learning outcomes. And the self-assessments of learning progress can also improve students' self-appraisal skills and enhance motivation and self-directed learning. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for lending your ears and thank you for watching.
That's all. Thank you and God bless.